Welcome to our weekly Church on the Rock podcast. For more information, visit us at churchak.org, download our Church on the Rock AK app, or like us on our Facebook page. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy our weekly podcast.
Woo! Can I just say, before we get rolling here, Papa Gene, as he's affectionately known around here, the combination of those kicks and that shirt, it was like Christmas in America. Well done. My goodness. Oh, man. It was 1995, 96, something along those lines. They had met several years earlier and had fallen in love, or at least he had. And he had gone through all the right steps, and he had talked with her dad and had all the conversations with the family, and everything was set. And the day finally came, and he proposed to her. It was on a beach in Homer, just down from Bishop's Beach. In fact, they've taken their children since to visit the rock where it happened. I just have to say, and I won't let you know who it was, but it might have been me. Like, he quoted a poem that was just stunning and beautiful, and she said yes. And they were now engaged to be married. And they were planning all of the events to come, the day that they would be wed and where all of that would happen. As they were getting closer and closer to the time, she approached him one day with some news. Not great news to him. And it was this: I know we've been sexually pure. We've made these commitments to one another. We're waiting for marriage in order to enter into that part of our relationship. But I need to let you know I'm actually already pregnant. Oops, I heard someone say, that's an understatement for sure. What would you do if it was you? Imagine it was you, and you were the one who was receiving this news, and how would you respond? How would you feel immediately in that moment? I can tell you how I would have felt, how I would have responded in that moment. And then the follow-up statement doesn't necessarily make it any better. She says, I just want you to know it wasn't another man. This child is from God. Great, not only are you unfaithful, you're also delusional. That doesn't help the situation at all. How could I possibly believe that? And if you could imagine the turmoil that would create for you, create in the relationship, then maybe you could imagine a little bit of what Joseph was dealing with in that moment. In fact, it's intriguing to me that there are no, and I'll say this because I realize anytime I make a statement publicly, people start Googling immediately. And so I found out last week in Talkeetna I was wrong. I said there are no Christmas songs about Joseph. And someone informed me afterwards that there are approximately 3 Christmas songs about Joseph. And I said, does anyone know any of them? And the answer is no. You probably don't know them. I didn't know them. So it actually makes my point. There's no popular Christmas songs about Joseph, that's for sure. We all know songs about the star and the angels and the shepherds and the baby and Mary. Mary, did she know? I don't know. Maybe there should be a song, Joseph, did you know? He's like, I wish I had known. That would have made this moment a lot easier for me. Joseph, did you know? Anyways. It's interesting. I feel like Joseph is sort of the unsung hero in the story. And as I was making my way through the nativity story again this time, I was actually shocked at how present Joseph is through the entire story and how rarely we talk about the role that he plays, because it's a significant role. And we're actually first introduced to the role that he plays in the very beginning of the story in Matthew chapter 1. And this is what it says in Matthew chapter 1, giving the family line of Joseph. This is the record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. I'll let you know, I'm not going to read the entire lineage. If you want to have a great time and learn how to pronounce all the names, you can do that later. My point is this, that it actually goes all the way down to this point. And Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Mary gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. All those listed above include 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 from the Babylonian exile to the Messiah. Now, I want to make a point here. Although Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus, from a biblical perspective, he is still the father of Jesus. In fact, so much so that they make a point to give you the family lineage all the way to Joseph because it's critical that the Messiah is born into the line of the King David. Joseph's heritage, his history, actually plays a critical role in this relationship and to the family in which the Messiah is going to be born. And I've heard people often refer to Joseph as the stepdad of Jesus. And I understand why people are making that distinction because he's not the biological father of Jesus. But here's what I can tell you as an adoptive father myself. He is every bit as much a son to Joseph as any of his other children. Like when it comes to the heart of a father, the affection of the father, the responsibility felt by a father, Joseph is Jesus' dad. But it doesn't come easy for Joseph. But I want to make this observation, and it is worth noting that God chooses, of all the ways his son could come into the world, he chooses to place Jesus in a family with both a mother and a father and a history. It's interesting when you read through the lineage of Jesus and any of the accounts, it's actually really intriguing to identify the people who are listed in there. In fact, it's one of the only lineages that lists some of the women who were part of the family line as well. Women of ill repute. Women you would say, why did he choose to put this person in there? And men like David who had an affair, or Solomon, or so many others. As you look through the family line, but there's actually something really specific that is being communicated in listing the heritage or the history of Jesus' family. And it's this, that God is redeeming, fulfilling, keeping his covenant promise with the people of Israel through the line of David and through an imperfect line as well. What I want to do today is I want to sort of highlight some things that I've observed in the life of Joseph as I've looked through this story fresh with new eyes again. And so I want to highlight 4 traits of a man that I discover in the story, in the account of Joseph. And the first one is this, and it actually isn't identified in the very beginning of the story, but Joseph is a working man. He's not just a working man, he is a blue-collar worker. In fact, in Matthew chapter 13, when there are some individuals who are arguing that Jesus couldn't possibly be the Messiah, listen to the reason that they give for this. They scoffed. He's just the carpenter's son. And we know Mary, his mother, and his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. They're like, how could this possibly be the Messiah? He's the son of a carpenter. Which doesn't sound that terrible to me. Like one of my early jobs, in fact, one of my first jobs after Kitchener and I were married was as a carpenter. I worked for a union company, Williams Construction in Oklahoma, and I didn't realize it when I'd said yes to the job, but in order to work for a union company, you also have to be a union member, which meant I wasn't just a carpenter, I was a cub carpenter. And I had to go take classes in Tulsa at night in order to continue working this job, and it was just not a really glorious job. You're the low man on the totem pole. You're building forms and all of that kind of stuff for large concrete slabs. They were an industrial construction company. And during that time period, I just realized this is not the kind of work I think I want to do the rest of my life. Maybe I should be a commercial fisherman. That seems more glorious. Just telling you it's not either. But the reality is that when they look at Jesus and when they look at what his father does, this couldn't possibly be the Messiah. I mean, surely the Messiah would come for him a more prestigious home. But Joseph was a working man. And that doesn't mean he was just a provider. He also trained his son in the trades that he worked in as well. And we find out later that Jesus was also a carpenter. But he was available and present. And he was passing on the knowledge that he had to his own son so that his own son could make a living in the world. But he wasn't just a working man. Joseph was also an honorable man. I don't know about you. I know it would be a unique challenge for me to receive the news that Joseph received, but let's take a look at it in Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 through 25. Matthew 1:18, this is how Jesus, the Messiah, was born. His mother, Mary, was engaged to be married to Joseph. But before the marriage took place, while she was still a virgin, she became pregnant through the power of the Holy Spirit. It's worth considering in this moment how you would respond to that news. Even if she gave full disclosure right out of the gate, I think for most of us it would still be uniquely challenging for us. It goes on to say this, Joseph, her fiancé, was a good man and did not want to disgrace her publicly. So he decided to break the engagement quietly. I don't know. I sort of feel like he probably felt disgraced publicly. Like she's going to be showing soon. She's going to be having this child, and everyone's going to know that it isn't his child. I don't know about you. I mean, maybe if they had social media back then, Joseph would have just posted an anonymous prayer request on his Facebook page, like, please pray for someone I know whose wife is preggo, like, and he's not the dad, hashtag it's me, right? Like I would want people to know, like, this isn't on me. I don't know. Like, I'm not to blame. Like, but he doesn't respond this way. He responds with this tenderness. Like, I actually don't want to shame her publicly, even though he will probably, in a small community, if you could imagine, someplace like Talkeetna or Willow or Homer, where everybody's in your business, like, that everyone was going to know what took place. And yet his heart is actually to honor her, even in spite of these things. And so he decided to break the engagement quietly. Joseph is an honorable man, but Joseph is also an obedient man, which, if you don't know this yet, is really unusual. Good. I'm proud of you ladies for not, like, you held it in right there. Like, we're all learning together. Obedience is a real challenge for sure. Here's what happens. Matthew 1:18, carrying on in the story. Possibly. Or not. There's demonic issues going on with the clicker today. So, as he considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Joseph, son of David, the angel said, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child within her was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and she will have a son, and you, Joseph, are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. When Joseph woke up, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded and took Mary as his wife, but he did not have sexual relations with her until her son was born, and Joseph named him Jesus. It's interesting, as I look through this story again, I begin to realize the angel of the Lord actually visits Joseph more times than the angel visits Mary. Probably because of the unique challenges that Joseph faced in coming to grips with this new reality. But also, Joseph is the one who is tasked with naming the child Jesus. And so when the child is born, this is exactly what he does. And I would just say this, Joseph wasn't only obedient in the adversity, personal challenge, but he was also obedient immediately, which actually really matters. In fact, if you have children, you know this really matters. In fact, I can remember being told numbers of times over the years, mostly for my sister's sake, because she's here with us today, because she was the naughty child, if you can imagine. Anyways, I remember being told a number of times, delayed obedience is just disobedience. Think about it in this context. If you have children, you know how this feels, right? You say to your kid, hey, I want you to go right now, and I want you to clean your room. And they respond with, no. In a minute. I will in a little bit. No, I think you misunderstood me. Like, I use these words, like, right now, which means a minute ago. Like right now, yeah, just a second, I will, as soon as I finish, right? But the reality is, intentional or unintentional, the fact is that delayed obedience, when you know you've heard from the voice of the Lord, delayed obedience is actually just disobedience. We're just afraid to call it what it really is. If you'll convince me one more time, but as soon as Joseph knows what the Lord is asking of him, which is a critical piece, as soon as he knows what the Lord is asking of him, he takes action immediately and obeys. I could identify 3 types of obedience I see with Joseph. He's courageous in the midst of adversity. Like, it doesn't matter if the thing that the Lord's asked of him is difficult or not, he's going to do it. He steps into it courageously. He responds by taking action, right? He responds immediately. He doesn't respond with intention. He responds with action. When it calls for action, Joseph takes action. And then he is decisive in his leadership. I don't know about you. It's a real challenge. I would much rather have consensus than lead sometimes. I'd love to have everyone on the same page, and often I will delay far too long in order to get to where we're going because I'm unwilling to take decisive action. But Joseph is willing to step into the role and the authority he has and lead his family decisively. Maybe you could understand how much of a challenge that can be when you think about the last time you asked your spouse, or your wife in particular, where she would like to go eat. And the response is, I don't care, you pick. And so you name some place, and the response is, yeah, any place but there. And so you name another place, and it's also any place but there as well. Eventually, you name every place in your town until you get to the one place that was actually the place that she wanted to go from the very beginning, and now it's almost time for breakfast the next day. Like you know what I'm talking about. Like, the reality is that often we're too far prone to want someone else to actually make the decision, and yet we are called to take decisive action. Joseph does that when it really matters, when it's really critical. In fact, probably the best example of this that I can think of is when the wise men, the Magi, come to bring their gifts to this newborn child, to Jesus. And they've come, and it is under much threat when King Herod discovers that there is another king born within his kingdom, within his realm of authority. And so the Magi go, they visit the child, they leave the gifts, and then they take off. And that night, Joseph has another encounter with the angel of the Lord. It's in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. After the wise men were gone, and the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother, the angel said. Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child and kill him. There's a whole other storyline here that this Joseph is actually leading the Messiah back into Egypt because he will also be the deliverer of Egypt. The other Joseph was taken to Egypt in slavery and bondage, and God called his people out of Egypt. But in this moment, he just hears the voice of the Lord. I don't know exactly how he knew. I know I've had moments, 3 of them in my life, where in a dream, I knew the Lord was saying something specific to me. And I woke up with a level of confidence that I had heard something from the Lord. This is what happens in this instance with Joseph. He says, get up, take the child, and flee to Egypt. And so, that very night, Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. I called my son out of Egypt. I love this because you can only imagine. I mean, this is the same night. Pastor Paul was telling us earlier this morning. He came in, he said, man, I had some weird dreams last night. And Pete offered to interpret them for him. Paul said, there's no interpretation for these dreams. It was just bad pizza. But in this moment, Joseph knows that the Lord has spoken to him. He wakes up the family in the middle of the night and says, let's go. If you're Mary and you got a kid, I'm just telling you, it takes about 12 days to pack for that trip. Like I'm just guessing it's a long trip, right? And well, do we have all this? I don't know, but we got to go. He's not afraid to take decisive action in obedience when he hears the voice of the Lord. Joseph was a working man. Joseph was an honorable man. Joseph was an obedient man. But this next one, I think, is probably the one that has stood out to me the most as I've read through this story again. And it's this: Joseph was a present man, which can be really difficult. I'm not talking about he was in the room. I'm talking about he was present. In fact, it's extraordinary to me when I read through the nativity story again, how present Joseph is in every scene, and it seems like I missed much of it. In fact, I would say Joseph was present with Mary at every step of this journey. I mean, think for a moment about the birth of Jesus, right? This moment where they cannot find a room to stay in, which some scholars speculate that because of the rumors that were circulating about this woman, Mary, the Romans had put forth all kinds of thoughts and ideas about what had happened and who the Roman soldier was that she slept with. If you're wondering where the name Pantera comes from, it comes from the name of the Roman soldier they accused Mary of sleeping with, and that's where this child came from. Shocker. Like all of those rumors circulating, and yet Joseph is fully present. And now they're in Bethlehem, and nobody's got space for them, even though it's his ancestral home. He's got family there for sure, but there's no place for them there. And so they end up in a stable. They end up in a manger for a crib, and here they are, and nobody else is present that we're told about. And Joseph is the one who is present to deliver this child. Like my guess is he's the one who caught the baby, cut the cord, like all the things. Like you want to talk about present, he was there. He didn't miss any of it, and he did not abandon her. In fact, it's referenced in this passage in Luke chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, which will come up eventually, I'm certain of it. I'm just going to set this over here so that I don't touch it again. That night, there were shepherds staying in the fields nearby. We have songs about them, by the way. Guarding their flocks of sheep, suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared among them. We have songs about these angels also, by the way. And the radiance of the Lord's glory surrounded them. They were terrified, but the angel reassured them. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I bring you good news that will bring great joy to all people." The shepherds hurried to the village and found Mary and Joseph. And there was the baby lying in the manger. Joseph is present at the birth of this child, but he's not just present at the birth of this child. 8 days later, he's also present at the dedication of this child. According to Jewish law, you had to go into Jerusalem, you had to go to the temple, and you dedicated the child there. You made an offering there, and as they approached the temple, there's a man who has been waiting his entire life to see the Messiah. In fact, he had received a word from the Lord that he would not die until the Messiah was born, and he has been hanging on to that. And in this moment, as they head to the temple in Jerusalem, they have an encounter with this man named Simeon. Here's the passage. It was time for their purification offering as required by the law of Moses after the birth of the child. So his parents, Joseph and Mary, took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. That day, the Spirit led Simeon to the temple. So when Mary and Joseph came to present the baby Jesus to the Lord as the law required, Simeon was there. He took the child in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, now let your servant die in peace as you have promised." And a woman named Anna and Simeon proceed to prophesy over this child. Joseph hears all of it, just like Mary hears all of it. And I can guarantee you his mind is reeling around all of the information that he has received about this son of his. He's present at the birth, he's present at the dedication, and then he is the one who is present when they return home to Nazareth, Luke 2:39 through 48. When Jesus' parents had fulfilled all the requirements of the law of the Lord, they returned home to Nazareth in Galilee. There the child grew up healthy and strong. He was filled with wisdom, and God's favor was on him. Like Joseph is the one, right, who goes home with the family, who begins to invest in this child, teach the trades to this child, be present for the upbringing of this child. He's at the birth, he's at the dedication, he's at Nazareth, but he's also back in Jerusalem with a search party. In fact, when Jesus is 12 years old, they've gone annually. Every single year, they've returned to Jerusalem for the annual festivals. And on this particular occasion, with Jesus at 12 years old, they've returned to Jerusalem for the festival, and now everything is finished, and they're headed back home. They're headed home with an entire caravan of family. So if you can imagine your last family reunion or family gathering where all of the cousins are present and aunts and uncles and everybody, when they go to head home, it takes them 3 days to notice that Jesus isn't with them. I know, you'd call OCS on them, but I'm just telling you, like if you've been at a family gathering, you don't know where your kids are either. Like, I don't know. I think they're in the other room playing with the cousins. What? They're not there? But imagine, and I know for myself, right, in that moment, if it happens in a grocery store, like my kids are missing for 3 minutes, I'm in full-on panic mode, right? I mean, you've heard me tell the story about, hello, pirate! Like, it's within reason the pirate stole my kids after that whole incident. Like, I don't know where they're, like I move into panic. This is 3 days, and it dawns on them, Jesus is not in their party. So they return to Jerusalem and begin to search for him. And when they find him, this is what we're told in Luke 2, 48 through 52. I love this. His mother said to him, don't make me slap you, boy. Like, because a mom would say, like, son, why have you done this to us? Your father, Joseph, your father and I have been frantic searching for you everywhere. Like you can read it in the language. And here's what I want you to notice is that Joseph didn't say, I'll wait back here, you go find your kid. You're not my son. You go find. No. He is all in. Like he's feeling all the same things that she's feeling while they're looking for this child. And then Jesus responds. It's not smart aleck, but it sounds a little bit smart aleck. Jesus responds, but why did you need to search? He asked. Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house? But they didn't understand what he meant. This is 12-year-old Jesus. He feels this drawing towards the very thing he was born into the world for. And so he takes advantage of this moment and completely loses track of all time and space. Those who are hearing him teach in the temple at 12 years old are astonished. Mary and Joseph are angry. Because their mom and dad, like, why did you do this to us? Moving on, it says, then he returned to Nazareth with them and was, listen to this, obedient to them. And his mother stored all these things in her heart. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. Isn't that interesting that, like, Jesus needed to grow in wisdom and in stature, and God places him in a family for that to happen. And this piece, this idea that Joseph was a present man, has been one that has been rattling my cage lately. You can go ahead and go to the next slide there, Jason. That he was a present man, and I look at these characteristics of Joseph, and I think to myself, well, I'm a hardworking man. Am I training up my kids in this same thing? Like, they might not be in the same trade that I'm in, but am I actually deliberately handing off that ethic to them? Joseph was an honorable man. Joseph was an obedient man, and Joseph was a present man. If you're like me, you begin to feel like, well, good for Joseph. Like almost any sermon, you talk about the character traits of some individual in the Bible, and we're not given a whole lot of detail other than these things about Joseph, which I'll just tell you, he's a pretty extraordinary dude. But here's what you need to also understand is that although Joseph was working and honorable and obedient and present, Joseph was not a perfect man. In fact, if Joseph had been a perfect man, we would not have needed this boy to be born. If Mary had been a perfect woman, we would not needed this boy to be born. I think over the years there was a lot of work that was sort of done inside of church circles to make Mary seem like she was perfect, that she should be the queen of heaven somehow, that she's somehow special and unique, and that Joseph also was a pretty good guy. But the reality is neither of them are perfect. They are every bit as much in need of this Messiah as any of us are. And yet, the sovereign God of all the universe entrusted his son to these imperfect parents. They're being shaped in this process, and so is he. Like he was placed in this family. So I want to make this observation again. Of all of the ways that Jesus could have entered our world, God chooses to place him in a family with both a loving yet imperfect mother and father. In fact, Joseph is as much in need of this deliverer as you are in need of this deliverer. Which raises the question, because part of the reason that I think Joseph gets overlooked is he disappears from the story after Jesus in Jerusalem at 12 years old. And so I've been asking the question, where did Joe go? Like, not that Joe, I'm talking about this Joseph. Most scholars would agree that somewhere between this 12-year-old incident and Jesus' public ministry that Joseph has died. Because if it had happened during Jesus' public ministry, it probably would have been referenced in the Gospels somewhere. And if it had happened before he was 12, well, he certainly wouldn't have been in the story there. But based on the character of Joseph, how present Joseph is all along the way, based on all of those things, the thing that makes the most sense is that Joseph has died somewhere between 12 years old for Jesus and the launch of his public ministry. And so by the time you get to the book of John, you get to Jesus hanging on the cross, when Jesus looks out, he's looking for someone to entrust the care of his mother to. And this is what happens in John chapter 19, verse 26 through 27. When Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple he loved, to be clear, this is John writing about himself. And so instead of just saying John, he's like, it probably makes more sense to let people know the disciple Jesus really loved instead of like Peter. When Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple he loved, he said to her, "Dear woman, here is your son." And he said to this disciple, "Here is your mother." And from then on, this disciple took her into his home. Actually tells us something unique about Jesus, the oldest son. Because Mary has other children. They're identified numerous times in the text, and actually tells us something about Jesus in this context, that he felt a sense of responsibility, which he probably inherited from his father, to care for his mother. And in this moment, he recognizes the person standing here with her is John. And I'm entrusting you to his care. But Joseph is no longer in the scene. And so I would just make this observation. Although technically we don't know where Joseph went, we do know who Joseph was. He was an honorable, obedient, and present father to the Messiah, which is a high and holy calling. Like, can you imagine feeling the weight of raising a deliverer? One who was designed and fashioned to rescue God's people. Which, by the way, is what every parent is called to do. The kids in your home, or the people you're discipling, or the spiritual children that you have, whatever it looks like, those relationships, but in particular in a parent relationship, and I'm speaking to dads in particular right now, like you were actually called by God to raise up a generation of deliverers. They aren't the Messiah, but they are the ones who are telling the world about the Messiah. And I think about it often when I think about my own children, like, am I investing in them in a way that I am convinced I've stored up all these things in my heart, and their future is the future of the kingdom in the world? And what would it look like for me to own that responsibility in the way Joseph owned that responsibility? So this is the question I've had rolling around. It's the question I'm going to ask you today. What is it about Joseph's character that you most want to see developed in yours? If you're like me, I look at it and I'm like, I'm pretty sure all of them. If I ask my wife, I'm pretty sure she's like, there could be a little bit of growth in each one of these. But there's one in particular that stood out to me personally lately, and it's this presence. Man, it's been a busy season. And it's so easy, in particular in my role. It's probably true for you too. I just feel like I'm special somehow. But in my role, to not leave work at work, to just bring it home, and to keep. And so I could be in people's presence, but clearly not present. It doesn't have to be work. It can be 1,000 other distractions. I've just been asking the Lord, what does it look like to have my life brought back into alignment in this area? Because it may be the one that matters almost more than any other. I could have all the right character traits and yet never be around enough to hand them off to the next generation. That's the one for me. I don't know what it is for you. Here's what I know is that the Lord does want to speak through the lives of the stories that are told in the scriptures. And I think, especially after reading through the story again, Joseph is one of the most extraordinary. It's an unsung hero and yet an imperfect man, entrusted with the perfect Son of God, and says yes to that weight, to that responsibility. I'm going to invite you to stand with us as we go into a time of worship, and as we come into this season, the month of December, and all the things that we're celebrating. My prayer is that you would hear these stories in a brand new way. You would see brand new things in them, but most importantly, that you would discover ways in which you and I could become just a little bit more holy for the holidays and for all the days ahead. So Jesus, to that end, as we begin to lift our voices in song and in worship, to that end, as we come into this season, would you speak? Would you give us dreams and visions? Would you give us courage? Would you call us to obedience in brand new ways? Could we experience the joy of joining you in what you want to do in the world, in our families, in our relationships? Would you show us how we can become more holy for the holidays? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you for listening. For more of our podcasts and to discover how you can connect, visit us at churchak.org or download our Church on the Rock AK app from either iTunes or Google Play.